Good morning, everyone. Unit 4 is now underway in our Latin American history class. I really enjoyed reading your blog posts on Unit 3. Many of you wrote about key issues like encomienda, repartimiento, and the way that corruption entered into the Spanish American administrative system. Those are very important points to think about. We'll continue to explore some of those ideas in Unit 4 as we also think about the role of indigenous people and people of African heritage, not only as slaves, but many of them, most of them, as slaves in the Spanish and Portuguese Americas. So as we get into Unit 4, again, remember the focus is to think about how those administrative systems that we've already been talking about impacted people of indigenous and African descent. How did they carve out a space for themselves in the colonial world? How were they able to even sometimes overcome the stigmas and the oppression that should have, or at least was meant to come, with the station that they were assigned in their own societies? Um, Although there was a caste system in the Spanish Americas, it wasn't as rigid as it may seem, especially when we look at the ideas behind it, the labels that were given to people, and so on. They were able to negotiate and navigate that system in a much more fluid way than we may think possible. Also, please take the time to read through or listen to, if you're able to understand Spanish, the Radio Ambulante podcast that I added to the readings for Unit 4. It discusses a Mayan judge who is continuing today to practice Mayan forms of justice, traditional indigenous forms of justice in Guatemala. And so, along with describing what those kinds of justice look like, the podcast also discusses how that type of justice comes into conflict with the justice system provided by the Guatemalan state. So again, a very interesting way to think about how the issues that we'll be reading about in Unit 4 continue even to this day, how indigenous people are still able to maintain an identity and to maintain many of their traditions, not only religious types of traditions, but agricultural traditions, social conventions, and even the justice system in their local communities. That will also go along nicely with the supplemental reading from Restal's book that talks about the myth of Indians coming to an end, as he puts it. So again, there was this idea during the colonial period that even though there was a República de Indios, a separate kind of section of the Spanish administration that was for indigenous people, eventually they were going to be assimilated to the Spanish way of doing things. And of course, that looked different. Spanish way of doing things wasn't the same thing across Latin America. Um, but again, there was this idea that the indigenous lifeways were going to disappear, and that didn't happen. So we need to think about how and why their traditions have been so resilient, and to see the strength of indigenous peoples in Latin American cultures and communities. Um, all right, so I hope that you enjoy Unit 4. Please ask questions whenever you have them, and I look forward to getting into our discussions with you on Twitter.